All right, hello students. Hopefully this works. Um, Sorry, I'm getting organized here. Take my glasses off so they don't reflect there. Welcome. I apologize that it's been kind of chaotic in the past couple of days, um, but I'm happy to be able to record this lecture for you guys. Lecture is maybe not a fair word for it. I'm basically just going to go through some slides and add some of my own thoughts to them. This is a pretty short section. This probably shouldn't be more than 20 or 30 minutes. Obviously, if we're interacting in a classroom setting, it's going to take more time because of discussion and those types of things. So after you finish the lecture on Moodle, you will find a quiz. It is about 5 questions long, and it includes questions related to the lecture. And some of it will ask for your input in a discussion type format. So hopefully I'm able to show you guys some of what I'm looking at here. And let's just see what we're able to come up with. I'm going to share this window here. That's not the one I want to see. Okay. That's not what I want. Just give me 1 second. Sorry. Does this seem really unprofessional? It's not. I'm just... That's what I want. Okay. So now what I'm going to try to do here is share the screen so that you guys can see. Basically what you'll be looking at are the slides. And then I will be able to show you the slides, and you'll be able to hear my voice kind of narrating that. I'm going to go to screen share, if it will let me. Okay, perfect. So, here we go. We are going to talk about, well, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about development. So you'll recall that last week we talked about development in general, and development in general, particularly early infant development, early childhood development, and how that was, a pretty neat thing. Sorry, this is a very weird thing, and so I'm kind of distracted. So, adolescence. I think we may have talked about this a little bit, but I want to go into this with maybe a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to read you guys what the book says is the definition of adolescence. It is the transition period from childhood to adulthood, extending from puberty to independence. So contextually, if we think about this in terms of what group of people we're talking about, we're basically talking about teenagers. So these are people who have sort of started to develop certain sex characteristics. They're basically reaching sexual maturity, and this is before they are able to sort of exist independently as people. And so adolescence is more of a cultural thing. It's much less a biological thing. There's sort of biological cues that sort of signify the onset of adolescence. But when we discuss adolescence, we're really talking about something that exists culturally, because you may find other cultures outside of the United States where the adolescence is much shorter. Somebody enters adulthood at a much earlier age, sort of after puberty, once they're in a position where they can sort of be independent, and not necessarily independent in terms of going out and being an individual, as much as they can have a job and support their family, et cetera, et cetera. So you may find somebody in an Asian culture who is, at age 18 goes off, works in a factory, and they use that income to support their family. That person wouldn't be considered an adolescent culturally. So puberty, not going to get into a definition there. Every single one of us has gone through puberty, so we kind of have an idea of what it is. We could talk at length about what those different characteristics are. I think that when we think about this in terms of how it influences behavior, we can just recognize those psychologically and physiologically as very formative years. There's a lot of uncomfortability and a lot of anxiety related to puberty when you're in puberty, but it's something that kind of all people go through. Obviously, for some, puberty is a lot more anxiety-provoking than others. But basically, we're talking about the development of different types of sexual maturity characteristics. So we have primary sex characteristics, which are basically reproductive organs. So on males, those are primarily external. On females, those are primarily internal. Basically, these are the things that make it possible for humans to reproduce. We then move on to secondary sex characteristics, and it's not as though one happens and then the next thing happens, but these are things that are not directly associated with reproduction. We can say that they're indirectly associated with reproduction and that they might facilitate arousal or things along those lines, but primarily we are looking at this as, things like breasts, things like a more defined jaw, different lower voice, different types of body hair, those types of things. So things that are sort of incidental to sexual development, but aren't necessarily directly tied to reproduction. Okay, so here's a dilemma. I'm going to ask you guys what you think about it, and you're going to tell me. So we have, by the way, I didn't look at my little bars up here, but I think that it's funny what I have. You can see that these are some of my ordinary things. These are my chords because I play guitar. This is a recipe for really good breakfast potatoes, in case anybody wants those, and also tough rowing machine exercises. So if anybody wants any of that information, you can feel free to let me know. Anyway, back to Kohlberg's moral stages of development. So some of the more interesting things, obviously a lot of childhood development, we're focused on how does a person go from being kind of a bag of mush to being, sort of what we would recognize as a person. Have most of the, the cognitive abilities, physical abilities that an adult person has. Adult development, I think, has the potential to be a lot more interesting in that we're shifting focus to certain relational challenges, to certain, higher level cognitive challenges that can be particularly compelling. So there's this guy Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg, and he was interested in how we develop over time related to morality. So what is sort of the nature of our morality over time? I'm not going to read this out loud to you, but you can pause and read it to yourself if you like. This part of the quiz, just this is a kind of a hint, part of the quiz is going to ask you what your response to this question would be. So I'm going to basically just ask you, I'll tell you what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to say, should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal this drug for his wife? Why or why not? Basically what Kohlberg would do is he would give people this response, and based on what their reasoning was, he would be able to assign them a particular stage of development. So he sort of divided up into three categories, and each of these have three subcategories that are less compelling and aren't necessarily going to demand our attention in the same way. But basically, we start out as pre-conventional. We do good things for rewards, we do bad things to avoid punishment. This is sort of the morality of a child, and actually Kohlberg said that very few of us, the vast majority of humans probably don't escape this stage of looking at moral reasoning. So essentially what he was saying was most people behave based on avoid pain and do things that we get reward. So if you were to ask them to explain their thoughts on a particular moral dilemma, you would see hallmarks related to, well, I wouldn't want to do a bad thing because I wouldn't want to get punished, or I would want to do a good thing because then people would like me, people would be happy. So that's what we sort of see as sort of pre-conventional. You can imagine this is the reasoning that a 5-year-old would give you, and incidentally, many 25-year-olds and 55-year-olds and 85-year-olds might give you the same thing, but most 5-year-olds are going to be at this sort of pre-conventional stage. As we move through adolescence, and especially kind of Teenagers are very interesting in that, I mean, at least in my experience working with teenagers, in that they have very just hard opinions on the things related to their experience. They say this is the way that it is, and there's really no other way of looking at it. But this is kind of the way that they think. So conventional is characterized by looking at the world based on sort of legalistic type of thinking. So you avoid doing bad things because that's the law. The law says not to do bad things, and it says to do good things. Now, it doesn't have to be, you know, the law necessarily. It could be a religious institution. It could be some other sort of cultural expectation. Basically, when someone says, why would you do something good, why wouldn't you do something bad, instead of saying, well, you know, as a pre-conventional person might say, oh, well, I want to avoid punishment, I want to get rewards, they would say, they would point to some institution and say, this thing tells me I am not supposed to do that, that it is not a good thing to do that, so I'm not going to do that. So this is one step above pre-conventional. So we're looking sort of beyond our own individual experience, appealing to some higher authority, whether that's God or whether that's, you know, the state of Missouri or whatever it is, and we're saying this is where I derive my moral reasoning from. Now the post-conventional is essentially an internalization of this experience. And so instead of saying I avoid doing this bad, you know, I don't want to kill a person because killing them is against the law, we say I don't want to kill a person because everybody has the right to life. We have sort of an internal experience that there's this sort of objective moral reality that we have access to, and we say that I see a morality that has value in and of itself. You know, that it isn't just some sort of arbitrary law or that somebody else has to tell me to do it. I do it because it's what I believe is the right thing. So we can look at post-conventional as being primarily characterized by an internalization of sort of some moral code. So moral intuition is sort of another sort of a nuanced way of looking at this. This will be a second question, or I mean not necessarily the second question, but an additional question related to that you will find on the quiz. And this always generates good discussion, and maybe we can have some of this discussion when we get to class. But what is the nature of emotional morality? So a lot of people would look at Kohlberg's material and say that Kohlberg's is very cognitive. He's looking at the world primarily through this lens of, you know, we have a thought process connected with our moral experience, and then that's it. There's this other school of thought that says, well, what if our morality is tied to our emotional experience, that we make moral decisions based on what we feel about them, not necessarily what our thought experience is of that. So you will probably have heard, if you haven't heard, this is a really interesting example, and I'm going to ask you to give me a response on this. What is, okay, so we have, I mean, I've heard this told like 30 different ways. But I'm going to tell it the way that I always remember it. Basically, you have a runaway trolley, and this trolley is going to run away, and it's going to hit a car full of people. And sorry, I'm changing this even as I say it, just because I always do. It's going to hit a car full of people. It's going to kill everyone in the trolley, and it's going to kill the people in the car. That's the path that the trolley is on. Runaway trolley is going to kill everybody in the trolley. It's going to kill the people that are in the car, which are on the trolley tracks. You are standing by a switch. You have the opportunity to pull that switch, and in pulling it, it would divert the trolley so that it would go onto a different track, a track that goes uphill. It wouldn't crash into anything in particular, except a child who is playing on the track. You can think of it as a man, you can think of it as a baby. There's another human life that is on the track that you would be diverting away from. So in the act of pulling the lever, the child or adult or whoever that is on that track is going to be killed. But that's all that would be killed. So through your inaction, the trolley full of people dies and the car dies, but through your action, all of those people are safe, but another person is killed. So what would you do? Okay, so now I'm going to change the question a little bit. In the same runaway trolley is going to, hit this van full of people. this car full of people. In front of you is a very, very fat person, someone who is 900 pounds. You have just got your pump on, so you're feeling pretty strong, and you have the opportunity to push this person in front of the trolley. They would, get stuck underneath the trolley and essentially serve as like a braking system that would stop the trolley. Obviously, they would be killed in that process, but the trolley would stop, and then no one would be hurt. Does this change your answer? Okay, I'm gonna ask you about this scenario. The question is going to be related to this. Does pushing or does pulling a lever generate a different emotional response for you than pushing the person onto the trolley? Would your answer change? Would you take action or would you not take action? And is there a difference in that question between the switch or the push? Okay. Moving right along. I don't know what we're at in terms of time right now, but I'm just going to kind of keep cranking along. So Erikson, we got this guy named Erikson, and he is pretty neat. Sorry, I'm trying to. I'm changing which screen I would like to share with you. Yeah, so I literally just, I pulled. This is in your book, but I didn't have it in the book, so I just kind of pulled this up. These are Erikson stages. They may look slightly different in your book. I'm actually not sure. But when we're looking at Erikson, what we're talking about are Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. Now, these are. We'll talk about the criticisms to this model in a second, but basically what Erikson said was this. Erikson was kind of a student of Freud, not like a direct student of Freud necessarily, but he was somebody that was part of that sort of early psychoanalytic movement, and was one of the first people that started to take things in a different direction. You'll remember that Freud, and we'll get to this when we talk about personality and maybe psychoanalysis as well, but Freud's notions of development were very focused on sexuality and essentially what was our relationship to our sexuality, and that sort of influenced our development. Those are called Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Now, Erikson came along and said, well, I'm thinking that most of our development has to do with our relationships to ourselves and to other people, and that we are going through these really distinct stages over the lifetime, and then in going through these stages, we will develop really significant sort of personality characteristics. So we're going to kind of go through each of these and give some examples, but basically they go like this. In your early childhood, so basically in your early infancy, the primary crisis that you have is trust versus mistrust. And if you look in your book, I think that this is in chapter 15, maybe chapter 16 of your book, I'm not sure. I'm not finding it. But I'm pretty confident that it's in here because it's one of the more important things related to psychology. Trust versus mistrust. Basically, what he would say is that each of these stages has a particular task assigned to it. Basically, you have to resolve. The task is to resolve the crisis that exists between these two ideas. So, trust versus mistrust says, are you going to learn to trust the people around you, or are you going to be characterized by mistrusting the people around you? Now, think of this as you're an infant, you're 1 year old, you are in your living room, you cry. Nobody comes to your aid. In an alternative universe, you cry, and somebody does come to your aid. Now, if you're just left alone, then what you may begin to experience is that I can't trust people. When I make a bid for somebody's attention, I'm not going to have that met. So I can't trust people to come to my aid. So then you would come out of that feeling like you generally don't trust people. If you're attacked in early infancy, if you're someone pinches your cheek way too hard, those types of things may be characterized characterized by mistrust. Incidentally, in adulthood, what someone like Erikson would do in the context of therapy is he would take a look at these people, try to get a handle on their personality, and basically come to the conclusion, for example, if they had trust issues, he would say, you got some unresolved trust things like from early infancy. And Erikson may have even sometimes come to the conclusion that, okay, you're like stuck in there. Like you haven't been able to move on from that because you've sort of been isolated in that. Freud was a little bit more leaning into that idea than Erikson was. So next stage, 18 months to 3 years, autonomy versus shame and self-doubt. Basically, this is one of the first opportunities for independence. So this is you come home from daycare, you show your parents that you made a macaroni sculpture for them, and what is their response going to be? Are they going to look at it and say, that's garbage, I hate it, don't do stuff like that, that's ridiculous? Or are they going to say, oh my gosh, that's really, really, really cool, I really like that? Obviously, if you are affirmed in your autonomy efforts, so if you behave autonomously, if you do things on your own, if you go pee-pee all by yourself, and those things are rewarded and affirmed, then you're going to come out of that experience feeling like you have a measure of independence, like, okay, it's a good thing to do things on my own. If, however, you're made to feel inferior in those ways, if you're made to feel like your macaroni sculpture is a piece of garbage, then you're going to feel a lot of shame around your efforts to be autonomous. Not only that, but you're going to feel a lot of doubt about your own abilities. So there's a lot of sort of self-esteem issues and insecurities that would come with unresolved things in this area. Initiative versus guilt, I always find like to be way too similar to autonomy versus shame and self-doubt, but it carries a lot of the same principles. Less so. Autonomy is more, can I do it on my own? So can I go pee-pee by myself? Initiative is if I try to do something through my own volition, so without inspiration, so without somebody next to me saying, hey, do this thing, am I going to be rewarded for that or am I not going to be rewarded for that? And again, the consequence of not doing that is that if I am somehow not able to be, don't have that initiative or that initiative is not rewarded, then I'm going to feel guilty about trying to initiate those types of behavior. So we talked a little bit about adolescence. So I would say that puberty, in a lot of ways, is characterized by these next couple of stages. But industry versus inferiority. I'm going to look up the book definition for this one because I'm stupid and I can't remember it. Where's Erikson's stages, guys? Why am I not finding it? Okay, here we go. Okay, and your book gets described as competency versus inferiority. So this is basically, can I do stuff or can't I do stuff? You know, do I know how to throw a football? Do I know how to divide, you know, math and that type of thing, or am I not? It's essentially if children are given the opportunity, if we're given the opportunity to be competent, to sort of demonstrate, like, hey, there are things that I'm good at. So remember we talked a little bit about Vygotsky and that idea of sort of these zones of proximal development and scaffolding and those types of things. You know, one of the key things in this area is if we are pushing people too hard or not pushing people hard enough. Basically, if we are saying, like, oh, in order to be an excellent fifth grader, you need to be able to do trigonometry. Obviously, that person is going to feel like a really profound sense of inferiority. Moreover, if somebody is not given the opportunity to sort of challenge themselves and push themselves, and they're just sort of really, really understimulated, then they also may not ever get a chance to really feel competent. Like, it may just sort of be this default experience. So this is one of those where we really want to help people sort of be stimulated by their environment in ways that are appropriate to their development. Identity versus role confusion. This is probably where you guys are, you know, regardless of if you're 21 or not. I think that those ages are probably more connected with, you know, averages and not necessarily applicable to college students in general. This is what you've been going through all through high school when you were deciding where to go to college, when you were deciding what to do with your life. You were trying to answer the question, who am I? Do I have an idea of who I want to be, or is my life just a big blur? So your primary task in this period of life is to figure out, what do I want to do with my life? Incidentally, when we get into like emerging, and we're going to talk about emerging adulthood here in a minute, we're going to talk about how that is. I mean, the traditional notions of sort of when your identity is supposed to form, when you're supposed to have an idea of what you're supposed to do with the rest of your life, when those are going to change. When those are now changing as opposed to what they used to be. Intimacy versus isolation, another thing that's been changing culturally in recent years. So I'll ask you guys this in the test. I don't know that I know the answer to it. I might have to look it up myself. But basically, my answer is how is intimacy versus isolation? How is the resolution of that task different today than it was 50 years ago? And the primary answer is that people today, like young people today in their 20s and 30s, are getting married later than they used to be. It used to be that if you were 30 years old and not married, you were an old maid. I mean, not necessarily an old maid, but at the very least, there were questions about your ability to be intimate. There were questions, not sexually intimate, but there were questions about, can you be in a relationship? Is there something wrong with you? Are you afraid of commitment, et cetera, et cetera? There are all those questions related to people that were starting to push into their 30s and were not yet intimate. And Erikson in that time may have said, okay, this person this task is unresolved, and this person is feeling isolated. This is what's changing today is that people will be doing this identity versus role confusion much longer, and not really be in a position where they are even concerned with intimacy. They may be involved in intimate relationships, but there may be people that say, I don't know what I want for my intimate life in terms of who am I going to invest in relationally. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't need to answer that question, and not sort of put that off a little bit later than they used to. Okay, so we got generativity versus stagnation. This is middle life. So this is the stage that your parents are probably in. The question is, nearing retirement, nearing the place where, they're most people that have been working at a place for a really long time, sort of get to a place where they don't have as much kind of menial work to do. They're thinking bigger picture, et cetera, et cetera. So then the question, the kids are leaving the house. There's sort of less and less day-to-day responsibilities for most people as they start to advance in these years. And what Erikson would say is the primary developmental task in this area is, are you going to keep being a positive member of society in terms of what you contribute, or are you just going to kind of coast and not really find another way to be a part of society as other different parts of your life change? Ego integrity versus despair. We could just call that integrity versus despair. Basically, this is, you're going to die. And are you going to just be bummed about that, or are you going to find ways to, again, sort of have a positive outlook and sort of take pride in your own identity, continue to be the person that you want to be, even though it's very likely that that person will die soon. I will also mention that if we talk about just how a lot of these things are changing, Erikson did a lot of his stuff like in, I think like the 40s, 50s, 60s, during a time when life expectancies were far lower. Average life expectancy, we'll say. I mean, there were still people living, into their 80s, 90s, 100s, whatever. But the average person, I mean, if we took averages across, everybody, 65 was when you retired because you were going to be dead by the time you were 70. Now, most people, at least in the United States, are comfortably living into their 80s, into their 90s. There's, more 100-year-old people than there ever have been before. So essentially, this is we're going to go ahead and talk about the criticisms of this model. The easiest thing for us to say is that this model is limited in that it is focused on, paradigms that really aren't the case anymore. We're looking at young people as being far less, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, far less, sort of subject to the same types of cultural expectations as they were in the past. We're looking at people living a lot longer. We'll talk in a minute about emerging adulthood. Let's talk about that now. But yeah, so we have this so challenging Erikson's things, part of what we're talking about is this idea of emerging adulthood. This is basically something that psychologists have come up with as a way to explain why so many people are moving back in with their parents. Really, it's a time where we're saying, hey, for some reason, there is not, not nearly as much definition as there used to be between adolescence and adulthood. It used to be that, you graduated from high school, you got a job in a factory, and then, you worked there for 50 years. Or you graduated from high school, you went to college, and then you got a job as a manager of a factory, and you did that for 50 years. In either case, there's this really clear delineation of what adulthood is. Our generation, so people, my age, a little bit older than me, and down to your age and a little bit younger than you, are sort of coming of age during an economic paradigm where, one, there is a whole heap of just general cultural change. So there's a lot of things that are just different when you think about technology, when you think about sort of the opportunities that exist to sort of go and be an adult person, but also sort of as a part of an economic, tradition where, there's less corporate loyalty. People aren't working for the same place for 50 years anymore. People are changing jobs a lot more frequently. It used to be that most people would probably work at a place for about 5 years. It was like the average, and that would include people that worked there for a month, people that worked there for 50 years. Now, most resumes, if you stay at a place for longer than a couple of years, or like 1.5 to 2 years, that's a long time at any particular place. It's something that you really don't see all that often anymore, especially with people that are sort of in this kind of emerging adulthood stage. We're looking at it as this place where kids are, I say kids, but young adults are basically in this position where they're trying to figure out what their identity is in a way that is sort of characteristically different than they have in the past. Again, we used to say, decide who you're going to be, decide early, and then be that. Now we're looking at the stage of emerging adulthood that says, go and figure out who you want to be. Spend some time. At least our generation is saying that. The baby boomers aren't very happy about it. But our generation is saying, before I invest my entire identity into a career, let me figure out what I want to do first. So you have a lot more people, like community colleges are exploding, vocational schools are exploding, online schools are exploding. Basically, there's a lot of people that aren't, more people were more educated than any other generation in the past, but most of that has to do with economic situations and the ease of access to student loans. Anyway, the point is that part of our criticism of Erikson's ideas are going to focus on this fact that there are significant cultural changes that have happened that, at the very, very least, are going to change the time frames that Erikson laid out. At the very least, they're going to change those time frames. At most, they're going to fundamentally undermine just some of those ideas. For example, the idea that intimacy and isolation are sort of antithetical to one another. That intimacy, what is the nature of intimacy in a technological age where we have access to someone all the time? Does it mean being with someone? Does it mean being near someone? What are the answers to those questions? And I think that a lot of them we just don't know. We don't know a whole lot yet about how Facebook impacts relationship. I think there's a lot of studies out there that say, yeah, there's an impact in terms of how social media affects our ability to engage with others, but this is a relatively new phenomenon. It may surprise you to learn that Facebook is less than 10 years old. I think, anyway. Now I want to look that up. Let's look up Facebook and see if it's more than 10 years old. Okay. Wikipedia. (2004). So it is. It turned 10 years old in February. Congratulations, Facebook, on turning 10 years old. Basically, my point is that, just the same way we don't really know what aspartame does to us, and aspartame's been around for a long time in Diet Coke, it takes us a long time to see these impacts. I guarantee you that there are more studies being done on the impact of social media than they've ever done in the past. All this, I'm going to wrap all that up again by saying that social the psychosocial stages of development that Erikson proposed have a lot of value in that they really do identify sort of key developmental ideas that we go through in our lifetime. People have always said about Erikson stages that, well, first of all, they're probably not as discrete as you think they are. Discrete in terms of like, hard and fast, like there's a really clear cutoff between this and this and this. So there's overlap. They're not as linear as you think. So these are some of the same things related to Piaget when we looked at his criticism. Basically, when we talk about development early on, and we said one of the challenges is we're asking, are these primarily stages, or is this something that's more gradual and continuous? Basically, anytime anybody comes out with this stage model, what everybody else says is, well, it's really not that discrete in terms of how these stages are split up. It's really more gradual than that. And generally, it's not quite that linear either. You're going to be working on more than one at the same time. You're going to be sort of identifying one, then circling back, and then having to do it all over again. But when we're looking for ways to explain how humans grow up, how does a person go from being a baby to being an adult when it comes to sort of the key features of their personality, the key features of their ego identity, Erikson's model is a pretty effective way of explaining that. So, ageism. Basically, what this is saying is that as a culture in the United States, we do a very poor job of being nice to old people. And maybe that's a weird way to say that, but there's a lot of discrimination. There's something called ageism. Ageism, again, is characterized by discrimination on somebody based on their age. Generally, we see ageism as somebody discriminating against somebody of a more advanced age. There are a lot of assumptions that if you are older, you are by definition less healthy. If you are older, you are by definition slower. Your memory isn't as intact. Sure. And if we're looking at correlations, absolutely, the older you are, the more likely it is that you're going to suffer from some of those types of ailments. However, in the same way that we could identify correlations, for example, between being African American and being incarcerated, that yeah, if you are African American, you're more likely to be incarcerated. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are cause and effect relationships there. Really the question that we want to ask is, why is that happening? Is there something wrong with our justice system? I'll save you the trouble of wondering. The answer is yes, there's something wrong with our justice system. The same principles hold true for older adults. Absolutely, we would want to be sensitive to the fact that, sure, maybe some older adults are going to need help getting from point A to point B. Some older adults are going to have a higher likelihood of dementia or cancer and things along those lines. But in the same way that not every person who's African American is in prison, not every person of an advanced age is somebody that is not as capable and as able-bodied as someone who's 20 years old. So that's where ageism kind of comes in, and I would encourage you as young people to begin to challenge your own experience of what ageism is. Okay, well that's about it. As I kind of went through this lecture, I identified just in my own head maybe 3 or 4 different quiz questions. The quiz may be 5 questions, honestly, I don't know. But please, now that you have finished watching the lecture, please go and do that. Go and do the quiz. The quiz will close at noon today, or no, 12:25-ish. Basically, the time that the second class period ends. So second class period, sorry, you don't have as much time to go through that, but tough luck. If you have any questions, email me. If you have any trouble with the quiz, email me. If you are lonely, I can't help you. Sorry. We will be back in class on Tuesday of next week. We will be doing lectures on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, and then I think you have another test. I think you have another test. Yeah. So that'll be quick. By the way, I recognize you guys all took your test last Tuesday. You want your results back. Fair enough. I understand. Working on it. Your tests aren't that hard to grade. it's more a matter of all these other things that are going on right now that it's kind of hard to navigate that. But I will be sort of grading your tests over the next couple of days. Hopefully they will all be done by the end of the week. If they're not, sorry, can't help you. I'll keep working on it. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email. Take care.